6 weeks into the war, near the town of Staria Russa, German soldiers pondered a strange contraption captured in recent fighting. It was an artillery system, but not like anything of their own. Each truck carried a crude-looking frame onto which rockets were loaded. The Soviet counterattack here had been supported by dozens of these rocket launchers. It had helped to stall the advance of the entire German Army Group North, striking towards Leningrad. They had bought time that would prove crucial. The BM-13 multiple rocket launch system, given the girl's name Katusha by the troops, was a rail launch rack on a truck chassis. Gears elevated and rotated the launcher rack into the correct firing position, as determined by an artillery sight. The rockets were very inaccurate and would rain down over a wide area, but the Katusha made up for this with a fearsome rate of fire. One Katusha could launch 16 rockets in less than 10 seconds. Firing en masse, they could devastate a massive area in the blink of an eye. Leningrad, Russia's Baltic seaport, was a key objective of the German invasion. From here, Soviet submarines and the Baltic fleet threatened Germany's supply of iron ore, which came by sea from neutral Sweden. The plans for the German invasion stated that the assault on Moscow could proceed only after Leningrad and its naval base at Kronstadt had been captured. Hitler, with growing confidence in his own military genius, was increasingly involved in strategic planning. He was now determined that, if necessary, the armored forces assaulting Moscow should be diverted to Leningrad. Army Group North, advancing on Leningrad, had been stopped at the so-called Luga line in July. This 175-kilometer line of fortifications had been hastily built by soldiers of the reserve and citizens of Leningrad. In August, Army Group North was reinforced with tanks and dive bombers from Army Group Center. They crashed through the Luga line and encircled the troops defending it. The Red Army fed its new KV heavy tanks into the battle. They were produced in Leningrad itself, at the Kirov factory. The front armor of a KV-1 was 75 millimeters thick. The German 37 millimeter anti-tank gun barely made a scratch. But early in the war, fuel shortages and poorly trained crews who didn't know how to repair their vehicle meant many KV-1s and other Soviet vehicles ended up abandoned at the roadside. On the 19th of August, a company of KVs commanded by Senior Lieutenant Kolobanov took up an ambush position near the town of Krasnogvardisk. Kolobanov picked the position himself, overlooking the highway as it wove through the marshes. When a column of German tanks appeared, his tanks took out the lead and rear vehicles and proceeded to destroy all 22 enemy machines. After the battle, Kolobanov's crews counted 156 marks where German shells had hit their tanks but failed to penetrate. After hearing reports about the KV tanks, Hitler once more demanded the capture of Leningrad and its factory that was churning out these monsters. But there weren't enough KV-1s to stop the Germans everywhere. While one German corps was held at Krasnogvardisk, others broke through near Ljuban and Tosna. On the 30th of August, the Germans cut the railway and the highway connecting Leningrad with the rest of the country. Finnish troops, allies of the Germans, approached from the north. The city's electricity supply began to fail. On the 8th of September, the Germans captured Schliesselburg on the shore of Lake Ladoga, the final act of encirclement. It was the beginning of a siege that was to last 882 days. When the siege began, the city's population was more than 2.5 million, including approximately 400,000 children. The city contained 300,000 refugees from the Baltic republics and surrounding area. The city's supplies of food and fuel were sufficient for just 30 days. Soviet counterattacks aimed at lifting the siege were all unsuccessful. The German encirclement near Schliesselburg was only about 12 kilometers wide. This sector was the focus of Soviet attempts to lift the blockade. That summer, Soviet counterattacks had robbed Army Group North of valuable weeks. It was time that could not be got back. Now the attack on Moscow would rob Army Group North of its best units. In his diary, the commander of Army Group North, Field Marshal von Lieb, wrote, 11th of September, desperate shortage of time. The Army High Command demands 7 mobile divisions be handed over to its control on the 15th of September. His tanks were on their way towards Moscow. It was a desperately needed respite for Leningrad. The same day, General Zhukov was appointed commander of the Leningrad front. His deputy, Major General Fedyaninski, came with him. Ivan Ivanovich Fedyaninski spent most of his military career in the Russian Far East. In 1939, he was made a hero of the Soviet Union for his bravery fighting the Japanese at the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. In 1941, he commanded a Soviet rifle corps in Belorussia, where he was badly wounded. Zhukov's appointment immediately inspired the defenders of the city. There was new confidence that Leningrad would be saved. With characteristic energy, Zhukov began to organize the city's defenses. Artillery was to be the key, and his secret weapon would be the massive guns of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet. Powerful naval gunnery halted the first German offensive just 7 kilometers from the city. The 12-inch guns of the coastal fort of Krasnoya Gorka also served to hold the German army at bay. The shockwaves from their exploding shells were powerful enough to hurl German tanks into the air. But where the German army had failed, the Luftwaffe might still succeed. 3 months into the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Army Group North was held up outside Leningrad by the heavy guns of the Soviet Baltic Fleet. So Field Marshal von Lieb turned to his dive bombers to sink the enemy warships. Their first victim was the old battleship Mara. 2 1,000-kilogram bombs struck her bow, causing her forward turret magazine to explode. she quickly sank to the bottom of the bay. 3 warships were sunk in total, depriving the city's defenses of 35 powerful guns. Around the city, 1,500 loudspeakers broadcast Leningrad city radio. Now it was also used to issue air raid warnings. When there were no radio programs, a metronome was put on the air. Slow ticking meant all clear. Fast ticking meant take cover. It became known as the beating heart of Leningrad. Above the city, German bombers were met with heavy anti-aircraft fire. But the Luftwaffe only made a few large-scale raids. Shelling by German heavy artillery proved much more lethal. Signs went up on street corners with the warning, "Citizens, this side of the street is more dangerous during shelling." The Germans didn't target Leningrad's tallest buildings or church spires. They were needed as reference points by the artillery spotters, who instead guided shells onto the city's bridges, houses, and shops. Leningrad was truly a city on the front line. Monuments were protected by sandbags and wooden screens, but many would not survive German bombardments. On the city's outskirts, the Germans captured the Catherine Palace and the Grand Petergof Palace. Both were looted and destroyed. The world-famous Amber Room was shipped to Germany. Today, its whereabouts remain a mystery. On the 8th of September, German bombers targeted the wooden Badaev warehouses, where the city's food reserves were stored. The glow of the fires could be seen across the city. Soon everyone knew that the flour and sugar supplies had been destroyed. But the situation was even worse than many feared. The city needed 1,000 tons of food every day to prevent starvation, but less than 200 tons were getting through the blockade. The little that could be brought in by air was nowhere near enough to feed the city's population. The main supply route into Leningrad now lay across Lake Ladoga, 50 kilometers of open water. But the lake was notorious for its strong winds and sudden storms. It was why, in 1718, Peter the Great had ordered the construction of the Ladoga Canal along the lake's southern shore to provide a safe waterway to the city. But the Germans had reached the southern shore of Lake Ladoga, cutting the canal and rail links into the city. The people of Leningrad had to build a new port from scratch on the lake's western shore. In the first week of the siege, barges were unloaded straight onto the beach. It was the beginning of a supply route that would come to be known as the Road of Life. Food rationing had been introduced at the start of the war. Leningrad workers received 800 grams of bread a day. Their dependents received 400 grams. By the beginning of October, it had been reduced to half that amount. It wasn't nearly enough to sustain those required to do physical work. At the end of November, the city was on the brink of starvation. Bread rations were cut further, 250 grams for a worker, 125 grams for everyone else. The quality of the bread was falling too, as the authorities turned to unlikely ingredients to increase its bulk. Bakers used burnt flour recovered from the ruins of the Badaev warehouses. They used oats intended for the horses, soya, barley, and even cellulose from the Goznak paper mill. People often had to queue for hours in the freezing cold to receive these meager rations. In November, 11,000 died from starvation, 350 each day. The medical staff could only look on helplessly. The early winter led to hopes that Lake Ladoga would quickly freeze solid, allowing trucks to bring in supplies across its frozen surface. But the ice took time to harden. The Soviets had hoped to establish a road bridge across the ice using the shortest route. But this would put convoys within range of the German artillery batteries on the southern shore. Slowly, the ice thickened. On the 20th of November, across 180 millimeters of ice, the first horse-drawn sleighs crossed the lake. 2 days later, the first trucks crossed. It was a perilous crossing. The 2-ton vehicles carried much less than their full load. But several still crashed through the ice, disappearing into the frozen depths. Drivers stood on their running boards, ready to leap clear if the ice began to crack. On their return journey, the same trucks were used to evacuate as many civilians as possible. The road of life was 30 kilometers long. It included garages, rest stops, and field hospitals. There were several alternative routes, depending on the ice and driving conditions. To defend the road, 2 defensive lines were constructed on top of the ice, 8 kilometers from the German-held shore. They included machine gun nests and ice trenches. The road was also protected by anti-aircraft guns and air cover. But German bombs and shells still claimed many victims. In the first week alone, 52 trucks were lost. Despite these extraordinary efforts to keep the city supplied and to get the civilians out, 53,000 Leningraders died in December, most from starvation. There were reports of people dropping dead in the street without warning. Each day, burial detachments had to remove 100 corpses from Leningrad's pavements. The diary of one Leningrader recorded how despair gave way to apathy. People now die in a very simple manner. First, they lose interest in everything. Then they lie in bed and never rise again. They die as if falling asleep, and the surrounding people, half dead themselves, pay them no attention. Many drivers on the road of life made 2 trips every day, one by day, one by night. Dozens of trucks were wrecked in traffic accidents, more than were destroyed by German aircraft. So the order was given for vehicles to start using their headlights. Trucks that crashed through the ice sank so fast that for several minutes, the ghostly glow of their headlights could be seen at the bottom of the lake. Almost 300 trucks were lost in the first month of the road. But they had kept the city alive. Hundreds of thousands perished from starvation in that first winter. The scale of the suffering was almost beyond imagination. More than 1 million would die before this, the most devastating siege in history, was finally over. Leningrad, encircled by German and Finnish forces, witnessed hundreds of civilian deaths every day. But these were not collateral casualties. Hitler had decided that Leningrad should be wiped off the map. Secret orders entitled The Future of Leningrad stated, "After Soviet Russia has been defeated, the further existence of this population center is of no interest. In this war for existence, we have no interest in keeping even part of this great city's population. For the Soviet Union, it was vital that Leningrad be held at all costs. It was an important industrial city with many factories and the home base of the Baltic Fleet. Its loss would mean the loss of the northern port of Murmansk, where the Arctic convoys arrived carrying military aid from Britain and America. And for many, Leningrad remained the cultural and spiritual capital of the USSR. Its fate was watched by people from across the Soviet Union. They came to see their fate entwined with that of the city. The Soviet High Command decided to breach the encirclement at its thinnest point, the Schlieselberg-Sinyavina corridor. Here, only 10 kilometers separated troops of the Red Army's Leningrad front from the front line of the Volkhov front. But it was heavily defended, with 3 lines of fortifications. On the night of the 19th of September, a small force led by Captain Vasily Dubik crossed the Neva River in fishing boats. His men quietly landed on the far bank and took the German trenches by surprise. With this foothold across the river, a Soviet Marine brigade moved rapidly to reinforce Dubik's position. This strip of land, called by the soldiers the Nevsky Piatachok, the Neva Patch, would become legendary. 2 German parachute regiments, redeployed from Crete, were amongst the reinforcements sent to crush the Soviet bridgehead. They were plunged straight into the ferocious fighting. They failed to eliminate the bridgehead, but had squeezed it until it was just 2 kilometers long and 500 meters deep. In October, this tiny strip of land was the only hope for lifting the siege of Leningrad. All Red Army reserves were on their way to Moscow, where another desperate battle raged. The struggle at the bridgehead was brutal, attritional warfare. German shells swept back and forth across the whole area, forcing the Soviet soldiers to dig deep to find cover. Another attempt to break through was planned for November. By now, bread rations in the city were down to 125 grams. They weren't much more for frontline soldiers. One commander conducted an exercise to test the strength of his men. Most were exhausted after walking just 400 meters. In a speech at Munich on the 8th of November, Hitler declared, "Leningrad has nothing to count upon. It will fall sooner or later. There are no forces to raise the siege. Leningrad is doomed to die from starvation." At the beginning of November, the Red Army got tanks across the Neva and captured more German trenches. In turn, the Germans fed in their own reinforcements. In November, the Red Army lost 5,000 men, killed in the Neva Patch. The Germans, too, suffered heavy losses. The tiny bridgehead had become a slaughterhouse. In Leningrad itself, 4,000 were dying every day from starvation. On some days, this figure rose to 7,000. January 1942 became the worst month of the entire siege. Non-workers had their food ration stopped entirely. The electricity supply failed. Water pipes froze solid in temperatures of minus 30 degrees centigrade. Furniture, wooden fences, anything that would burn was used for firewood. One Leningrader, Yelena Skryabina, wrote in her diary, "Death has become a phenomenon observed at every turn. When you step outside in the morning, you stumble over corpses lying in the gateway and in the street. The dead bodies lie there for a long time because there's nobody to dispose of them. Even in the worst months of the siege, the people of Leningrad still went to work. The Kirov factory, just 4 kilometers from the front line, didn't stop producing tanks for a single day. Half-assembled tanks were even used to fire on the enemy from the factory floor. The Leningrad Institute of Plant Industry was dedicated to the research of commercial crops. It contained the world's largest seed bank. 28 institute workers died from starvation during the siege. But the plant breeding collection containing several tons of crops, rice and potatoes, remained intact. In February 1942, the food situation gradually began to improve. The ration was increased to 500 grams for workers, 400 grams for office workers, 300 grams for children and non-workers. The revolting additives to the bread were used less and less. People now received their rations on time and almost in full. On the 16th of February, meat in the form of frozen beef and mutton was distributed amongst the population for the first time in months. Things were starting to look up. So far in the war, the Red Army's prospects of lifting the Leningrad siege had been limited, because the fighting around Moscow had sucked up all available reserves. But by January 1942, the German army was retreating from Moscow. Now, a large-scale operation was possible at Leningrad. Soviet divisions on the Volkhov River prepared to assault the flank and rear of German Army Group North. Swampy, broken ground meant that tanks were of little use. The success of this offensive will be down to the infantry and the artillery. Meanwhile, General Fedyaninski was put in command of the 54th Army, tasked with breaking through to the besieged city. The Germans turned the high railway embankment near the village of Pogostye into a formidable earthwork. Red Army losses were horrendous, their progress minimal. The Second Shock Army, under General Klekov, attacked German positions near the town of Ljuban, to the south of the fortified corridor. But in their haste to raise the siege, the Stavka High Command ordered attacks that were not properly planned and lacked proper artillery support. One divisional commander, General Antufeyev, reported, after crossing the river and climbing the left bank, Our infantry came under intense machine gun and mortar fire. Our artillery couldn't suppress the enemy fire. It couldn't even make a proper ranging and didn't have enough ammunition. The survivors had to return to their starting positions. Red Army units had advanced 30 kilometers through the frozen forests and swamps. It was the same distance again to reach Leningrad. The threat of encirclement hovered over the German troops. The logical decision seemed to be to order a retreat, but Hitler had forbidden any more retreats. Field Marshal von Lieb, commander of Army Group North, asked to be relieved of command. General von Kuchler was now in charge. Von Kuchler concentrated on holding key roads and railways. This approach was the German salvation. Army Group North was able to keep its units resupplied, and reserves could be moved quickly to threatened areas. Meanwhile, the lead units of the 2nd Shock Army had to be supplied by the only road that ran along a corridor just 5 kilometers wide, between the villages of Zamoshia and Spasskaya Polist. The forward units were short of ammunition, food and fuel. The Soviet offensive was called off in February. Now the men prepared to defend the ground they'd captured. But it wasn't easy digging in the middle of a swamp. And the supply problems meant many soldiers began to suffer from malnutrition. In March, Hitler demanded that von Kuchler encircle the Soviet troops that had dented the German line. The operation was codenamed Wild Beast. A simultaneous assault by 5 German divisions effectively sealed off the Soviet penetration. The Soviet 2nd Shock Army was virtually cut off from the rest of the army. Just a tiny corridor, 1.5 to 2 kilometers wide, was left open. All that remained was for the Germans to crush the encircled Soviet units. But first, they launched a fresh assault against the Neva Patch. By April, 1,000 Soviet soldiers were dug in there. The Germans waited until the River Neva was full of drifting ice, making it impossible for the Soviets to reinforce the bridgehead. Then they unleashed a torrential artillery barrage. The last sign of life seen from across the river was a crude banner bearing the single word, "Help." Meanwhile, the encircled 2nd Shock Army received a new commander, Lieutenant General Andrei Vlassov. By the beginning of May, the Stavka had decided to try to extricate the remnants of this battered force. But the day before the planned withdrawal, the Germans attacked. The Soviets fought desperately to hold the perimeter as units began to withdraw through the tiny corridor back to the front line. But it was slow progress, and 4 days later, the Germans finally cut off the 2nd Shock Army. A Soviet artillery officer recorded conditions inside the pocket. The entire area was swept by German fire. The dead and wounded lay all around. Some were delirious. Others cried out for water to drink. Some even asked us to shoot them because they couldn't do it themselves. The Germans didn't attack. They kept us trapped like an animal in its lair and bombed and shelled without mercy. The last soldiers to escape slipped out under cover of darkness. By the end of June, 10,000 had got away, but the Germans had 30,000 prisoners. Amongst them was the commander of the 2nd Shock Army, General Andrei Vlassov. Vlassov agreed to cooperate with his German captors and became a willing tool of Nazi propaganda. He wrote pamphlets entitled "The Appeal of the Russian Liberation Committee to Soldiers and Commanders of the Red Army" and "Why Have I Taken Up the Struggle Against Bolshevism?" In them, he appealed to Red Army soldiers to join a new, anti-Bolshevik Russian Liberation Army. Vlassov helped to recruit Russian prisoners of war to fight against Stalin. General Vlassov became so notorious that Russians referred to all Soviets who sided with the Germans as Vlassovtsi. But most had no allegiance to General Vlassov. The so-called Hivis were Soviet prisoners of war who helped the Germans in non-combat roles. And many anti-Bolsheviks and nationalists from the USSR fought in their own Wehrmacht units, known as the Eastern Legions. Most of Vlassov's Russian Liberation Army was captured near Prague in 1945. Its men were sent to the Gulag. Vlassov and other officers were hanged as traitors. The Red Army had failed to break the Leningrad siege in the spring of 1942. Now, the road of life across Lake Ladoga began to melt. On just one day, the 20th of April, about 80 trucks were lost through the thinning ice. The road of life was closed to heavy vehicles. The Russians waited anxiously for the lake to open to shipping. They knew that when it did, ships and ports would come under heavy air and artillery attack. The severe winter meant it wasn't until the 22nd of May that the lake was clear of drifting ice. The first ships made their crossings, evacuating civilians and bringing in supplies. Soviet air defenses proved highly effective. Only 1% of incoming supplies were lost to German air attack. The Germans sent for Italian MAS torpedo boats, which had proved effective in the Mediterranean, and Seabull armed ferries, which had been designed for the invasion of England. But despite grand expectations, Axis naval forces failed to make an impact. Russian tugs and barges had an extremely shallow draft, so torpedoes passed harmlessly underneath them. Their naval bases and ships were hit hard by the Red Army Air Force. Axis naval operations were abandoned. It remained critical to break the siege of Leningrad. The road of life, by water or ice, brought in the bare minimum to keep the city fed, and the troops supplied with fuel and ammunition. 6 months later, in November 1942, the front commanders, General Zhukov and Marshal Voroshilov, began to plan Operation Iskra. It was decided to attack once more at the bottleneck, where the German encirclement was thinnest. Units of the Volkhov front would attack from without, as troops of the Leningrad front attacked from within. The artillery barrage began at dawn on the 12th of January 1943. As the last shells whistled overhead, the assault began. But everywhere the Red Army ran into fierce resistance from well-entrenched German troops. T-34s could only crawl across what was effectively a heavily cratered peat bog. They were easy pickings for the German anti-tank guns. But the simultaneous attack on both fronts began to bear fruit. After 2 days, just 2 kilometers separated the Soviet troops. These final meters proved the hardest. Soviet tanks were knocked out or got stuck in the bog. It was up to the infantry to storm the German positions. General Fedyaninski, now deputy front commander, repeatedly visited the front line to urge his men on. He ordered attacks around the clock. There was to be no let-up for the German defenders. The German tactic, as before, was to hold key positions along the transport network. Work settlements number 1 and number 5 on the only road between the lake and the rail terminus were turned into fortresses. If the Red Army could just cut the road, the German defense was doomed. Von Kuchler had to decide whether to hold on or withdraw from the bottleneck. He opted to hold on. Under unrelenting assault from both sides, the German defences began to crumble. The Red Army, sustaining massive losses all the way, fought through the intricate German defences. At the last moment, German units at Schliesselburg made a dash for safety, but not many made it. At midnight on the 18th of January 1943, Yuri Levitan, the voice of Soviet wartime radio, was able to announce, after 7 days of fighting, troops of the Volkhov and Leningrad fronts met on the 18th of January and raised the siege of Leningrad. In just 3 weeks, a railway was built across the cratered landscape of the bottleneck. It was just 5 kilometers from the German lines and under constant shell fire. Leningrad was still on the front line, but at last it was getting enough food and fuel. The Red Army lacked the strength to push the Germans back any further. The reserves of German Army Group North had arrived and were dug in on the high ground. German defences were traditionally built around the MG-34 or the MG-42 machine gun. The rest of the infantry were effectively there to support the machine gun team. By autumn 1943, the Red Army had developed tactics for attacking German infantry. Soviet rifle platoons, supported by artillery and mortars, aimed to wipe out enemy machine gun positions in the first few minutes of the assault. The remaining rifle-armed Germans would be seriously outgunned by Soviet troops armed with submachine guns. But from late 1943, the Germans began to change the balance once more with the introduction of the MP-43. Now, if the infantry squad's machine gun team was knocked out, a squad armed with the new MP-43s could still provide heavy, accurate fire against enemy attackers. Hitler himself gave the new weapon its name, Sturmgewehr, the assault rifle. It wasn't until the beginning of 1944 that the Stavka launched the operation that would finally end the siege of Leningrad. By then, German Army Group North had had nearly 2 years to dig in on the outskirts of the city. The Stavka planned to begin the operation at the Oranienbaum bridgehead, which had stubbornly held out against the Germans thanks to the heavy guns of its coastal fort. From here, the Red Army would launch itself against the flank of German Army Group North. Leading the attack will be General Feduninsky at the head of the Second Shock Army, which had been secretly redeployed to the bridgehead under the cover of darkness. By attacking from the coast, the massive firepower of the Baltic Fleet could be used to support the assault, with more than 100 heavy naval guns available for the operation. They included the guns of the battleship Mara, refloated after being sunk by Stukas in 1941, and the enormous coastal guns of the Krasnaya Gorka fort. The assault began on the 14th of January 1944. Soviet newspapers and radio carried no reports about the operation, but the people of Leningrad could hear the distant thunder of the bombardment. They knew what it meant, that the final offensive was underway, the one that would end the siege once and for all. No one doubted its success. The attack from Oranienbaum caught Army Group North by surprise. In the face of an overwhelming Soviet assault, German defenses collapsed. A week later, Soviet troops, laden with captured trophies, met at the town of Ropsha. German Army Group North retreat became a rout. The front line raced away from Leningrad. The rumble of guns receded into the distance. At long last, silence descended over the city of Leningrad. According to official reports, 642,000 civilians died during the siege of Leningrad. But many deaths never made it into an official report. The real total was probably nearer 1 million. 3% were caused by bombs and shells, 97% by starvation. About 1.8 million people were evacuated from Leningrad during the war. By 1945, the city's population was just 1/5 of what it had been at the start of the war. This was the longest siege of a large city in World War II, and the costliest siege in history. Army Group North was bogged down in the forests and swamps around Leningrad for more than 2 years. It comprised 1/5 of German strength on the Eastern Front. But pinned outside Leningrad, it was unable to influence the war's decisive battles, all of which were fought on other fronts. Far to the south, in the vast open expanse between Kharkov and the Volga River, the Red Army would have to learn to fight another kind of war, highly mobile armored warfare. And it was here in the south in 1942 that the world would learn the name of another Soviet city, Stalingrad.